If we take a look at what types of historical resources our ancestors used for medical and public health care, we do find some significant developments in those areas that we've mentioned before in terms of geographic locations, like China, the Middle East, the Indus Valley, and the Nile Valley. One of the oldest texts or books or encyclopedias of the use of medicinal plants can be found in China. In fact, it's still often used today, or the more modern equivalent are used today. And that's the Great Herbal of the Emperor Shennong. It's about 3000 BCE was when these compilations were originally put together, which is roughly 5,000 years ago now. And some of these medications, some of these combinations and formulations of plants and herbs are still used today. That's why if you try to look up sort of the history of Chinese herbal remedies, what you'll find are modern applications. There really isn't anything ancient in terms of they're not used anymore. These are remedies that have been successful for thousands of years. The real founding father of Chinese medicine is called the Yellow Emperor Huang Di, who lived about 4,500 years ago, around 2500 BCE. He developed what's considered the canon of internal medicine, or the Huangdi Naijing. The Yellow Emperor's canon is one of the earliest medical texts or medical encyclopedias found in China, and is comparable to some of the ancient medical texts found in other civilizations, but especially uses the application of herbs and herbal remedies for treatments of disease and maintaining balance in the human body. This compilation, and one of the oldest copies that we have, is from about 1100 BCE. If we take a look in the Indus Valley, we do find in the what was called Indo-Persian area of the world, sources that are still used today in what are called the Vedas. The Rig Veda, the Arthra Veda are sources of spiritual healing and spiritual guidance, but also include some fairly practical applications of medical treatments. Starting around 1200 BCE was when some of these documents were first originated. Again, we can still find in the Arthra Veda and the Rig Veda some of those texts and resources still used today. Much of the healing has taken place because of the willingness or the benevolence of gods and goddesses. And again, there are human beings, there are people today that still rely on these resources for health and wellness. We take a look at the Middle East. We have the ancient biblical references to sources of epidemics or plagues and different treatments. One of the devices that was used to store the Ten Commandments, called the Ark of the Covenant, was said to be a source of punishment for others who tried to take this ark. And so oftentimes diseases or plagues or pestilence were considered to be part of the punishment, especially if we take a look at the biblical Old Testament descriptions. For the New Testament, one of the attributes that was unique to the individual recognized as Jesus Christ was his healing ability, his ability to heal and eliminate disease. So we don't think of it oftentimes when we talk about some of these religious resources, like the Rig Veda and the Atharva Veda, the Bible. Many times our ancestors did still incorporate and associate diseases with divine punishment or divine intervention. And there was a lot of mysticism and magic involved in medical care, or what we would think of as medical care. Until we get to ancient Egypt. And some of what we still have today, which is relatively prolific in comparison to other places in the world and other civilizations, are the documents that have been left to us from ancient Egyptian physicians. Egyptians had prolific artwork that we still have today, depicting everyday life, including skills like bread making and beer making and the use of this mystical process called fermentation. How that we can take mixtures of water and grains that have been ground up and maybe some honey and other materials and other foods, and then see that food transformed into something totally different by the invisible forces that we now, of course, associate with fermentation, making bread and making beer. In fact, making beer and wine from fermented cereal grains and grapes and crops became quite an industry in ancient times, not just in Egypt, but in other places in the world as well, especially associated with the Middle East, because that was the ideal location for many of the cereal grains. Wheat and barley in particular, those were ideal geographic locations for the emergence of those cereal grains, which we now, of course, know are the foundation for making beer especially. But what has this got to do with health and wellness? Well, as it turns out, we do know, and particularly for wine, that sometimes these sources of beverage, beer and wine, could also be used, especially wine, to clean out wounds and is a source of keeping and drinking a healthy source of liquids, because sometimes water wasn't necessarily a healthy thing to drink, but the wine, which had been treated, of course, by the microorganisms that produced the wine, was safer to drink. We do have documentation left to us through what we would think of as books, some by the earliest Egyptian physician who's recognized as Imhotep. Now, Imhotep was and is thought to be what's called a polymath. He apparently was interested in all types and had knowledge and abilities in all types of areas, not just medicine. He was an architect and apparently lived roughly 2700 BCE, or roughly 5,000 years ago. If we take a look at some of the tools that the ancient Egyptian physicians used, like Imhotep, we can clearly associate and recognize them even today. They used scalpels or knives. They had forceps, hooks to pull back flesh. They had scales. They had different kinds of devices like scissors, illustrated at the bottom, as well as probes, balances, and even what's not labeled on this drawing but illustrated sponges that could be used to dab or soak up fluids. Many of these illustrated tools, when they're recreated, can in fact work exactly the way their modern equivalent. And in fact, a surgeon today could look at many of these tools that were used by the ancient Egyptian physicians and easily determine how those tools could be used. The source of this information in the medical textbooks are written on a plant-like material called papyrus. Cyperus papyrus is a marsh plant. So some parts and areas around the Nile River, the Nile Delta, is where these sort of lush, woody, or sort of very tough, fibrous plants grow. You can see they're somewhat tall. They have this sort of palm frondy looking top on them. And when you separate the fibers, these fibers are very tough. And if you crisscross them and create a mat, you wind up with a nice sturdy writing surface that actually is pretty durable. And many of these papyri have survived for thousands of years, still intact, with lots of rich color with their illustrations. Some of the writing on these papyrus documents, or papyri if we're talking plural, using the word plural, are in the form of what we call hieroglyphs. Most students are familiar with hieroglyphs. They look like little animals, and they're definitely clearly symbols as a source of communication and writing. For the ancient Egyptians, though, they did have an everyday script that's called hieratic, and did transform into a type of writing called demotic in more recent ancient times. They included in these medical texts both magic and medicine. So the medical books still relied on the intervention of gods and goddesses, or what we would call incantations and prayers, along with typical medical treatments, particularly if we were trying to treat someone with an injury. Treating an injury still had the typical first aid that we might associate with what had occurred perhaps with the ancient Neanderthal Shandar 1, where you definitely could stitch something back together or mend it or stop the bleeding. Those types of interventions seemed more practical in comparison to possibly medical interventions that required an incantation or an accompanying prayer, because it was due to some type of internal medical problem. Regardless, these are the resources that we've inherited down through the millennia from the ancient Egyptian physicians. Some of the symbols that we take for granted today. The Eye of Horus actually represented measurements that were used to measure a grain. They could use it just in everyday business when we're measuring out units or sort of piles of food. It could also be used to measure out sources of herbs for treatment. And the Eye of Horus illustrated on the left shows you the different parts of the Eye of Horus and the unit measure, going down to 1/64th of, so a tiny little bit of whatever we were measuring out. The Eye of Horus, you could see, if we modernize it, winds up with that image that we recognize today as the symbol for prescription or pharmacy. And so it would correlate or make sense that, yes, indeed, this was the symbol that could be used when we're trying to tell someone how to measure out or how to create and put together different herbs or different medicinal sources of material to treat a disease, and was used by our ancestors thousands of years ago, those who derived from ancient Egypt, and even if we take a look in areas of Iraq, ancient Iraq, some of the first drugstores were established there in Baghdad around the 8th century, still using similar symbology and similar units of measure. One papyrus that's a medical papyrus that's important is called the Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus. Now, the age of the remnant that was discovered and is retained now in the museum is one that was probably a copy of a copy of a copy from an earlier piece, roughly about 2600 to 2200 BC. But the copy that was retained or discovered was written around 1600 BC and includes a combination of medicine and magic to treat different traumatic conditions. Now, there was a very straightforward, what was called rational approach to treating that condition, and there were dozens of physical trauma examples and how to treat them in this document. It's thought that possibly the original author was Imhotep himself, and we have a difficult time actually confirming that, but based on the language and some of the concepts that are written in the document is how scientists and how historians have made that connection, that this original document was written a long time ago and definitely incorporated what we recognize now as that combination of treating natural conditions and not necessarily thinking that someone got injured because they were being punished by some kind of supernatural source. Another important medical papyrus from ancient Egypt is the Edwin Smith Papyrus. The Edwin Smith Papyrus was interesting and unique because it introduces a concept that we take for granted today that we call triage. We think that triage is something that was a modern invention of medicine, but it wasn't. In ancient times, if a physician was faced with a patient or a patient was coming for care, the ancient Egyptian physician would have three possible choices in terms of what to do. He might tell the patient, this is a condition that I will treat. They knew that they could tackle it and possibly help the patient get better. Maybe this was a challenging condition, and they would have the second choice of a condition which I will contend. So they're going to try to help the patient, but the outcome was possibly, a little bit iffy. The third possibility is that the physician would tell the patient, this is a condition not to be treated. Now, there are two possibilities here. If you were told this by your physician, it could be that you would definitely go home and get better because it wasn't that serious, or you would definitely go home and die because there wasn't anything the physician could do for you at all. So this is an idea of sorting out the serious illnesses from the not so serious, and also the illnesses or conditions that nothing could be done. The Edwin Smith Surgical Papyrus had a very rational approach. In addition to typical triage information, it also included descriptions of diagnosis, in other words, what was wrong with the patient at the time, prognosis, expected outcome, based on treatments that were available at the time, as well as even some footnotes to give future physicians some insights into how some treatments were derived, or comments about the possible success of those treatments. Another medical papyrus that we've inherited from our ancestors, the Bruch or Berlin Medical Papyrus, again, probably a copy from an older document, much older document, around 2000 BCE, was a source of information about gynecology for contraception and fertility. There's the earliest known pregnancy test in which a woman was instructed to urinate or pour her urine over small bags of barley and a wheat seed called emir. And if those grains sprouted, then she was pregnant. Fertility and the health and wellness of mothers and children was of great importance to many of our ancient ancestors, including the ancient Egyptians, because that, of course, is the source of people to do things. Again, productivity. If you have a high mortality and infant mortality, then you're not replacing your citizens, you're not replacing your population, and things can't get done. In fact, it wasn't unusual to have a 50% mortality of newborns and infants up to 2 to 3 years. In some places, in some cities or towns or locations, children weren't even given permanent names until they were roughly 5 years old, because the likelihood of them dying was so high. So many times, many of these medical papyri that we've inherited from ancient Egyptians and ancient Egyptian physicians relied on giving good care to moms or prospective moms, because women's health was very important. We wanted healthy moms, we needed healthy babies, and making certain and ascertaining if somebody was pregnant was an important medical tool. So even today, when this test was performed, it was determined that there was a 70% accuracy in determining whether or not a woman was pregnant. So for at least for that point in time, it was fairly reliable. And even back then, what they said was, depending on which grain sprouted, you could determine the gender of the baby. Now, modern replication or modern duplication of this procedure hasn't supported that. But we definitely do find that this grain-based pregnancy test does work.